As human beings, we are quite curious about one another, particularly about one another's faults and struggles. If you're like me, when you hear St. Paul say, "A thorn was given to me in the flesh," your curiosity perks up. Wonders, what did he struggle with? What is this thorn? Many people, like ourselves, over the centuries have wondered the same thing. And there have been 3 proposed answers to the possibility of what this thorn was. First, the ancient church fathers, particularly John Chrysostom, saw this thorn as persecutions and plots against St. Paul. Such adversaries like Alexander the coppersmith. We hear Paul talk about him in 2 Timothy, saying, "Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. Beware of him yourself, for he strongly opposed our message." Another view was during the medieval period, where it was not so much about plots, but it was about the sensual, carnal temptations. Now the third view is referring to some bodily ailment, some physical affliction that Paul suffered from. In Paul's writings to the Galatians, we get a particular insight, not only into the bodily ailment, but possibly what kind. In Galatians 4, Paul says, "You know it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first." And in Galatians 6, Paul says, "See with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand." From these passages, it has been said that the ailment very well could have been some vision impairment, a cataract of some kind. Now, of this thorn, we could have good insights and speculations to what it was, but what we know for sure is that Paul had some thorn. He had some affliction. Now, we must recognize 2 things. First, this thorn was not Paul's doing. He did not give this thorn to himself. As he says, "The thorn was given to me." In the Greek, the word used to give in this passage is put in what is called the divine passive, indicating that God is the primary agent, that God is the one who gave this thorn to Paul. Secondly, we must recognize that Paul refers to this thorn as a messenger of Satan to harass him. What does that have anything to do with it? I mean, if God is the primary agent, what does a messenger of Satan have anything to do with this thorn? There's a reality here, my brothers and sisters, of a double agency. God is the primary agent, while the messenger of Satan is the secondary agent, revealing that God allows and uses at times a messenger of Satan so that the purpose of God might be fulfilled. In Paul's case, so that he might not become too elated or prideful. Paul had a radical conversion to Christ. He was given amazing gifts by God. We hear in our reading today Paul talking about the abundance of revelations or visions he had. How easy it must have been for Paul to be prideful. We hear that Paul begged 3 times for this thorn to leave him. John Chrysostom says that by Paul begging 3 times, it's really indicating that he asked repeatedly. This wasn't an act that was done 3 times. It was a constant, fervent, repeated prayer. We hear Paul saying, "I begged the Lord." He pleaded with the Lord to take this away. And what is the Lord's response? "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Rather than removing this thorn, God allows it to remain. Why? Because the thorn has a purpose. St. Jerome says, "The Lord is good, because he often does not give us what we desire in order to give us something we would prefer." My brothers and sisters, God knows what he is doing. He has a plan and purpose for everything. God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and hope. And Paul knows this. He knows that God can produce good from his thorns. Otherwise, he would not have said in the book of Romans, "We know that in everything God works for good for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose." Paul knows that God is the only one that can take his thorn, this messenger of Satan, who is harassing him, and draw good from it. Why? How can I say this? Well, because Paul only preaches Christ and him crucified. The most complete act that reveals God's power to take evil and produce good from it. The most horrific evil ever, deicide. Man kills the Creator and crucifies him. It was this paradox, the paradox of the cross, of suffering, of evil that Christ endured, that brought about our very redemption, the greatest good, man's ability to be reunited with God once again. This paradox is why Paul can respond to God and say, "For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Now, everyone here has a thorn. Maybe thorns. Like Paul, maybe you suffer from a bodily ailment, such as cataracts, cancer, migraines, arthritis, intestinal issues. There are many. Or psychologically, you could be suffering from depression, or anxieties and fears running your life. Sin, something we all struggle with. Maybe you are caught in habitual sins that you can't break free of. No matter how hard you pray or how many times you go to confession, you are still a slave to these sins. Like St. Paul, our thorns, whatever they might be, have a purpose. Your sufferings are not meaningless. Yes, they are horrible. Yes, they frustrate you. Yes, they make you cry out to God and beg him to take them away. But let me remind you that in everything, God works for good. Everything. Sin, evil, weakness, failure, suffering, everything. Not some things, but everything. God works for good. Even your thorns, God is going to draw good from them. And what is this good? What good can God draw from our thorns and our sufferings? Ultimately, our salvation. And here is the paradox in our lives. Our thorns are the very means of our purification. Our thorns open us up to God's saving action in our lives. These thorns, every time we experience the pain from them, bring us to the garden with Jesus in Gethsemane, where Christ asks the Father, "May this cup of suffering pass, but not my will, but your will be done." We too must ask God the Father to remove these sufferings, to ask for our cup of suffering to pass. But if not, we must trust that God knows what he is doing. God the Father knew what he was doing when he gave his Son the cross, and he knows what he is doing by giving you yours. But we can't stop here. We can't just know that God has a purpose. We have to experience it. Otherwise, what I have just said, or what St. Paul has said, will fall on rocky soil, and it's going to bear no fruit in our lives. And this is why we are here at Mass. We come bringing our thorns, our crosses, our weaknesses, our evils, and we place them on this altar. And we beg the Lord to transform them. As he takes ordinary bread and wine, may he transform our thorns, our evils, our crosses into Eucharist, into his very body and blood, which gives us life and thanksgiving for our thorns. our thorns united to Christ in Eucharist, is the grace that is sufficient for us. So come to the altar. Come weak, come broken, come full of thorns. Be transformed into Eucharist, into thanksgiving. So with St. Paul, as we go about the daily struggles in our lives, we may always utter these words. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.
Very well.